This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Well, since we're in Atlanta, I actually wanted to start by asking you an Atlanta question. In your poem Pastoral, there's a moment where, right before the photograph is taken, you imagine this pastoral backdrop being raised over the skyline of Atlanta and sort of obscuring that. And I'm interested in that moment where a kind of idealized space covers over a real space. And maybe you could start by talking about how that particular image came into focus in that particular poem.
You know, it had everything to do with thinking about the fugitive poets and the fugitive agrarian movement, the idea of the real sort of nostalgia they had for certain southern spaces, and a feeling against urbanization and the industrialization of the South. And so what I was trying to suggest was the way that that is kind of false. The New South, indeed, as represented by Atlanta, is the Atlanta skyline. It's a lot of things. And so in order to affect the idealized southern space that they might have been interested in having as the backdrop for their photograph, I have to create this surreal backdrop in which imaginary cows are actually in motion, making sounds that echo my terror at being in this photograph with the fugitives.
But also in Native Guard, it seems to act as a pivot, because in the first section of the book, there are many scenes where you're imagining a modern or contemporary landscape having been laid over a previous one. For example, you talk about the beach having been constructed over the mangroves and so forth. And it seems like, in a way, that you are not just picking an argument with the agrarians in that particular poem, but you're kind of pivoting toward being able to maybe reimagine parts of your South in ways that are not obscuring, but are actually maybe preserving something that's important.
Well, yeah, I think that that's right. You know, each of the sections does begin with a poem that enacts a kind of journey. Theories of Time and Space, which is the sort of the Ars Poetica for the whole collection. The Train Journey, which is Southern Crescent, that begins the section of elegies about my mother. Pilgrimage, which begins the middle section about history, and so it's a pilgrimage back to certain spaces in Mississippi. And then finally, Pastoral, which is a kind of journey into this past where I might have been able to take such a photograph. It's also, for me, a hinge, as you say, because it is the moment where I am trying to lay out this idea of the Southern canon, and it is an attempt to interject myself into that by taking that photograph with the fugitives. I hadn't thought about it in the way that you say, that indeed each of those, for the most part, each of those beginnings has to do with other narratives being laid over. I mean, certainly that's what pilgrimage is about. The way that there's even as time has changed, there's still this attempt to go back to maintain this narrative, which of course, because we're not in the antebellum South, is quite false and is being overlaid onto the contemporary South.
And in Southern Crescent, there's the moment when your mother's youthful journey is laid over the train trip that you take with her in memory.
Right.
And so there are these moments where it almost seems like either a layer is peeled back or a layer is put on top. And so, I mean, not to push the metaphor of the book too hard, but it seems like these are ways in which you're creating these kind of spatial palimpsests that echo or have some sort of relationship to that document that you imagine the soldier riding over in Native Guard.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that I was most familiar with, that I was obsessed with growing up on the Gulf Coast, was the beach. Indeed, that it had been bulldozed and covered with this fake beach.
So you actually remember what it was like before that?
Well, no, I mean, because that happened before, in the 40s, late 40s, I think they did it, or early 50s. So, but I always knew about it because we called it the world's longest man-made beach. So I always knew that it was this constructed thing.
Are there signs nearby of what it would have looked like? I mean, what it used to look like before that?
You know, I don't know if I've seen anywhere along that entire coast what, except in photographs, what the mangrove swamp would have looked like. But it reminded me about the way that you know, both there's that kind of concealment and erasure. I also think about on the Mississippi Gulf Coast the way the natural world both reveals and at the same time conceals certain things about the past, and that there's the potential for revelation if we're only willing to sort of look closely at it. And I think look at some of its metaphors. I mean, another one that I was always interested in was the fact that there was probably a, you know, if you had a good telescope and you were standing on the front of Jefferson Davis's last home, you could probably see out to Ship Island. And the idea that he could look out there at this island where those former slaves and soldiers had been stationed. It's interesting to me.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.